I mean, people really care. You know, I think people care about their skin a lot. It's not a coincidence that dermatology shows up in an episode of Seinfeld. I don't know if you guys remember this episode of Seinfeld where George is trying to show this guy the mole on his back at a party. I think it is. I'm not sure where it
It's
is.
a pimple popper
But
MD, I recall.
is that what it is? Well, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
he calls her pimple popper MD.
Dermatology is the one place in medicine where there's enough demand on the consumer side where I think people, that and anything involving kids, where I think people will be very happy to pay.
Welcome to the Darby Mills series, Intrepid Pioneers of the Next Economy, featuring discussions with entrepreneurs at the forefront of deploying machine intelligence and brainstorming sessions about where the technology may go at the limit.
Welcome to the Darby Mills series, Intrepid Pioneers of the Next Economy. I'm Ajay Agrawal, co-founder of Intrepid Growth Partners, and I'm here with my three collaborators, all of whom are senior advisors at Intrepid. Neve Gavin, Rich Sutton, and Sendel Mullinathan. This episode, we explore cancer detection. We're here with the leadership team of Skin Analytics, a UK-based firm using AI to automate the diagnosis of serious skin conditions, starting with skin cancer. Neil is the founder and CEO, and Jack is the AI director. All right, let's start the show. Neil, we'll begin with you just giving a quick synopsis. Everyone's read the summary, but if you can just describe also for the listeners, what is the essence of the business, and in particular, the key prediction that your system makes.
Thank you very much. So Skin Analytics has built a series of artificial intelligence algorithms that we regulate as medical devices that are able to make autonomous decisions about potential skin cancers. So we can take an image of a skin lesion and then we can predict whether or not that patient has skin cancer, a pre-malignant type of lesion that we could treat, or a benign lesion that doesn't need to be taking healthcare resources to resolve. And so the idea behind the business is that we can use this artificial intelligence to effectively replicate many of the decisions that a dermatologist would, which is aiming to address the significant shortfall of specialist dermatologists that we have around the world for patients with potential skin cancers.
Thanks, Neil. And can you describe, so yours is the first product of its type to make it through the regulatory process in the UK, with the NHS, the National Health Service. Can you describe what's involved in getting through the regulatory process? Like, in other words, is it all about prediction accuracy, or what are the key elements of that process?
Yeah, we're very proud of being able to be the first company to launch an autonomous skin cancer pathway anywhere on the planet, and we did that first in the UK. The journey to get out to the point where the device could be used autonomously started first with a version of the algorithm that was supervised by clinicians that had appropriate, what we originally called safety nets and eventually second reads, to be able to evaluate that the technology was as good as we thought it was in making those decisions and working in the messy reality of medicine, where there's a significant amount of gray. So that took us a number of years from launching commercially to be able to get to the point where the system was proven enough to work autonomously. But to get through the regulatory process, there's three foundational elements that we see. Firstly, the technology has to be good. You have to figure out how to make the thing work. And I think you guys have spent a lot of time in your careers and also in this podcast series talking about how do you translate this potential that the maths has brought us into something that can actually work for patients and be reliable enough to work for patients. And that's a non-trivial part of our business that we spend a lot of time on, and Jack can talk more about that. The second foundational element is really bringing the clinical evidence to support that the technology can do what you say it can do. And, that starts out with observational clinical studies and then moves into prospective clinical studies. And increasingly, you raise the bar in terms of what you're asking the AI to do and how you evaluate whether it can do that. And then the final piece of the puzzle, rather, is making sure that you have the appropriate systems in place to run a company that is making decisions that affect patients' lives. And so from our point of view, we're making decisions around cancer. Delayed diagnosis can lead to death. And so there's a very high risk of our product not working in the right way, which means that as we build out our product, we have to make sure that we have appropriate quality management systems for every possible aspect of our business, from building the technology through to how we do post-market surveillance, to how do we interact with patients and capture any issues that need to be resolved. And so we've had to build these systems into the very fabric of our business. And then we've had to be audited for, I think, by about 3 separate bodies, probably a sum total of about 15 times now. We've had people come in and audit, 1, that we meet the standards, and then 2, that we continue to do that ongoing. And so taken together, the technical, the clinical evidence, and then the, if you like, the quality assurance part of our business, that's what allowed us to get through that regulatory hurdle and get the product into the market.
Okay, thanks for that, Neil. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I will circle through Neve, Sendel, and Rich if they have any clarifying questions. And then we will shift gears and talk about where might this go at the limit. So, but my question for you is, I think you started this project a decade ago, or maybe even longer. And I remember we had a conference that Rich was at in 2015. At that time, when people were trying to describe what would be a valuable, useful application of image recognition, one of the first things that people talked about was reading medical images. And so my question is, what took so long that even as of today, you're the only one that's made it through, I think, this regulatory process. So why is it so hard? And in other words, was there elements to training the model to get past an accuracy threshold? Like, what was it that's so hard?
So yes, I started the business in 2012. So we've been at it for a number of years now. And I guess to answer the question, what's so hard from a technology point of view, when we started the business, we were using classical machine learning approaches. So we were trying to meet dermatologists and clinicians and trying to ask them to explain to us what it was that identified something as skin cancer to them. And it was frustrating to me as someone with a maths background that the answer was, yeah, it just looks wrong. Something looked funny. And it's like, I can't codify that. How do I measure it looks funny? And so we spent a lot of time, and there were some metrics people would give us, the number of colors, the symmetry of the shape. And we basically codified about 100 different things that we were measuring. And then we were trying to optimize the weightings for those. And it just didn't work. The technology wasn't sufficient to be able to make the decisions. And then we moved into the world that we're in now, or that we moved into the world around using deep learning. And that very quickly changed the capability of the systems, but we had so much to learn about it that we didn't know. So, back then, I think the idea was you just needed a ridiculous amount of data. You put it in, and then everything was great at the end. And we saw that just wasn't true. And we did that. We thought we did a great job. We thought we had an algorithm that worked, and then we did a test, and we told everyone in the test they had cancer. And that just clearly wasn't true. And so we realized that we'd made a massive mistake here in terms of overfitting and all the sorts of, things that are well known now that we were sort of on the forefront of falling into the traps for. And so it took us a while, I think, for us to understand how to understand how the technology worked, and then try and make sure that we could design our system to operate around those problems. And we as a business have been very slow and methodical about making sure we do that in a safety critical system where failure means an impact on the patient's life. And so we wanted to be very sure that we knew how to do that. And I think the other challenge is that while you are obviously 100% right in my opinion that healthcare is one of the best places to start applying this technology, not a lot of healthcare is digitized. And so it's true that if you go into a hospital and you're taking a radiology image, that's digitized. In dermatology, there was not a lot that was digitized, and it meant that the data that had been collected was in no way representative of what the patient population actually looked like. So, for example, some of the earliest data sets we got were from dermatologists who just collected it out of interest. And the way that they would collect it is they go, oh, that's weird. I want to get a record of that. Patient, do you mind if I keep this and take an image? And as you can imagine, if that's what you're training a system with, it's not going to work very well. And so it took us a while. We had to go out and start digitizing a lot of the data ourselves. And obviously weren't the only ones, but we had to get a hold of enough of this data that is indicative or more illustrative of the patient population. And that took some time to do. And then on top of that, you have to generate the clinical evidence. And then from a company our size, you then had to figure out how to operate with 200 standard operating procedures that govern the way you do everything to make sure that when you build something, it works for patients. And this just takes time. I think we've done it pretty quickly on the grand scheme of things, even though it might feel like it's taken a really long time for that dream in 2015 to become a reality in 2025.
Excellent, Neil. Thank you. Neve, any clarifying questions?
Yeah, thanks, AJ, and kudos to the team. I think I have a quick one about where the patients drop off after your referral. And let me prefix that a little bit around or broaden the question to the importance of the end-to-end platform versus just the image. So as I think you alluded to at the start, where you've been very clever is around creating a digital pathway for the entry point of the patient, enabling them to opt in and say you can be seen quicker via AI or wait and see a doctor. Then they upload the patient history. But thereafter, when you've kind of done your binary decision of yes or no, we think this is benign or malignant, what you'd really want to do is follow through that end to end, start reviewing the treatment that's being prescribed to, how effective that is, and loop it back in. And ideally go with the patient on their journey in case there's any future discovery and capture that re-entry back in so you can course correct. So how do you currently get that longitudinal data and where does it drop off? Is it just that passing on to the dermatologist or how far do you follow through?
So I think you've hit on one of the key aspects of us as a business. So one of the very early decisions that we made that in retrospect, I think is proven, but at the time was considered to be a bit of a mistake, to be quite frank. Because at the time when we first started doing this, everyone was talking about appifying the world. Everything was going to be an app. Everything was going to sit on your iPhone. You didn't need anything. It was all going to be your phone doing everything. And we said we refused to deploy our technology in a way that it wasn't embedded into a healthcare system. Perfect. And the reason being was exactly what you just outlined, is that telling a patient they have something is the end of our role in the pathway, but it's not the end of the patient's role. And it is actually, from a patient perspective, the utility of that decision is exceptionally low. The utility for them comes after they get the treatment. And while we don't want to be a treatment provider, we do want to sit within a system that solves that problem and really unlocks the value of being able to do that at scale. And so for us, that meant deploying within the UK's National Health Service, or with partners that were set up to take the output of the artificial intelligence and then do something with it that actually meant something to the patient, which is, biopsy, treatment, or discharge. And so that was a really critical element of our business. And just one other point, you're right to say that right now the vast majority of the use of our system is sort of a referral, non-referral, or a red light, green light. That's not how the algorithm necessarily works. It's how people are willing to use it in the short term as we build up more and more confidence. There is a lot more power in the algorithm to identify pre-malignant lesions that can be treated in different ways, things that could be followed up over time, and then things that could be directly listed for biopsy, which we're increasingly seeing an appetite to do, which allows you to really optimize your use of healthcare resources from the moment the AI has made a decision. And so we are definitely pushing very, very hard into the space where we've built up enough trust in the AI that we can start to really radically optimize the existing healthcare system. Now, that's not where we're trying to get to, and we're going to talk more about that later. But right now, our focus has been optimizing the healthcare system and pathways that exist and making sure that patients get that treatment faster.
Excellent. And I confess it was somewhat a leading question in terms of I do want you to capture that follow-up. So that's terrific. Thank you.
I guess your company is all about getting the classification right. I mean, there are all these other steps, but it sounds like the major use now is you're saying yes, no, referring or not referring. So the question is, how much of the company is about getting the classification right?
So our underlying AI models are trained on lesion classification. So we have our data that comes through our pathways. We have a very high accuracy on the labels we have for our data. Then all the malignant lesions are labeled by pathology. So I think that's a really interesting thing in itself, because we train the input to our models is a dermoscopic image, just an image of the skin before a biopsy has been done or anything like this. And then we're trying to map that onto a lesion classification, which is confirmed using histology. So that's information that's very difficult to know with a high degree of accuracy at the time the image is captured, and can only be found later after a biopsy is performed.
I think I wasn't clear. I was just, there's many aspects which you're doing, the interaction with the patients, there's the, and then there's, you gather the data and you make a classification. And I want to know how important to your business is getting that classification right. Could be that it's not so, that's relatively straightforward and that's kind of done and you're dealing with all the other things. Or it could be that getting classification accuracy, increasing it by a percentage or two is really critical to your business.
Yeah, so the classification is critical to our business. And we spend a lot of time fighting to get even small incremental improvements that we can either assign to improve diagnostic accuracy or sensitivity, or to the discharge rate or specificity, or the ability to route patients to the appropriate care pathway. But we fight for that tooth and nail, because each little incremental improvement on it unlocks a lot of downstream utility for the healthcare system. Because while we don't do the downstream treatment, if I can tell you that a patient that's referred in the UK on an urgent skin cancer pathway can instead be sent to a treatment option where they could have a topical cream applied, and that doesn't eat up a dermatologist's time, that is a significant cost and utility benefit for the UK's healthcare system. And that will be true in every healthcare system. Just to build on that very slightly, while we talk about the classification having low utility to the patient, the utility for the patient comes on the treatment option. But within the healthcare system, the blockage is not on the treatment. That can be done by so many different people that you can train up. We don't have a problem there. We have a problem on the classification step, where you need specialist clinicians, where you train for 15 years and have to pay them relatively large salaries in the global scheme of things to be able to make those decisions. And that constraint is how we've designed our entire healthcare system. Primary, secondary care, it exists in its entirety to deal with that scarcity problem that we're able to address with being good at the classification.
Do you have to come into a clinic to gather the data, or can a person do it in their home?
We can do it in many different settings. So we do some of our pathways, patients collect the data at home, and some of our pathways, they come into a clinic. There is a lot of flexibility in this data acquisition. Right now, we use, as Jack mentioned, a dermoscopic image, which is a lens that is relatively simple. It basically has cross-polarized light and a couple of filters in it, and magnifies the image a little bit. So a very simple bit of additional technology that we use that can attach to a smartphone, or there's a variety of different ways you can solve that problem. That's what we do right now in our path, in our sort of product roadmap. And we're getting some really great results on the research side of things at the moment. We're removing that dermoscopic attachment as a requirement. So we're able to maintain the diagnostic accuracy without the dermoscopic attachment. What we lose is some of the ability to discharge patients. So you'll have an over-referral rate that is higher, but you can pick that up later with a dermoscopic image at a location, or however that you wanted to deal with it. But the direction of travel is to eventually use the sensors that are available or in the hands of everyone at home, and be able to really streamline the way that we do this.
Sandal, any other clarification questions on your side?
Yeah, I think I want to pick up on something you had said about, Neil, about integrating into the health system rather than going direct to consumer. What were some of the unexpected things, positive or negative, that you sort of encountered in the process of trying to work yourself into an existing decision system?
So one of the things that surprised me when we made that decision is that when I started out with it, there are many reasons why it was the right decision. But my very first hypothesis was that to get something that was trusted by patients, we first needed to be trusted by doctors. because, and certainly you've seen this change over the last 10 years, but when I started the business, doctors were still held up as the place that you got any answer to do with your health. And I thought that if we didn't have clinicians believing that the technology worked, we'd never get patients to get the technology, to believe the technology worked. And I actually don't think that's true. I think that was something that we got wrong. I think patients are a lot more open to believing that technology works than clinicians are. And that if that had been the primary driver for going into the healthcare system as the reason that made the most sense, then we would have got that wrong and made the wrong decision. In the actual fact, as I explained it to you, Neve, that I personally and everyone in the company feels very strongly that our job is not to make a classification decision. It is to get the patient what they need, an outcome, and that the classification decision is really the critical step in that from our point of view. But from the patient point of view, what matters is getting that diagnostic decision or that outcome that they need. And that is the real driver that decision has led to us being able to fulfill. But that came later. That realization was not something that I started the company with. That was what came out of talking within the healthcare system, talking to patients. So early on, within the first couple of years, but it wasn't the first proposition or first reason.
All our listeners will be able to imagine what you've described, Neil, in terms of a patient either at home or coming into the hospital or clinic, and getting a picture taken and having an AI classify a skin lesion or a mole as malignant or benign or pre-malignant, and then that classification leading to a set of actions inside the healthcare system. So that's what it looks like today. In a previous episode of this podcast, we talked about, it was in the geological exploration industry, and their version of a biopsy is to drill a hole into the ground to take out a core sample. And when we started talking about what does this industry look like at the limit, and I know both Neve and Sendel have thought a lot about the healthcare industry at the limit. In the mining industry, or geological exploration, they made reference to a lot of other data that could be collected and much cheaper, like the dust or the chips off the drill, and satellite imagery and other things, even before they do the expensive drilling decision. And if I think of the drilling decision as analogous to the biopsy. And so maybe I'll start with just our group, and then Neil, come to you. Neve, any comments of where you think this goes at the limit with this type of high fidelity classification capability?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it almost questions the gold standard itself, in that if I understand correctly, skin analytics now outperforms dermatologists in the same way as Rich said on the mining one. The algo will see thousands or hundreds of thousands more data than an individual expert will in a lifetime, and so that almost kind of questions by what bar are we assessing it against. In terms of other data, and this is something, again, around alluding back to the question I asked at the start of how far and how much patient history they capture in their pathway, and how much they get to see after the fact. I always wonder if it can, kind of flipping your question, AJ, whether skin analytics can almost be a biomarker or a predictor for other broader issues. So, for example, on the way in, they see that, oh, okay, this patient smoked all their life. They have a higher number of moles on their skin than normal, albeit the majority of them are benign. However, 5 years after they came to us, they were diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. And so I wonder if there's, looking at the patient in the round, whether there's patterns that can almost broaden the utility and additional benefit to the patient of skin analytics. In terms of other data, I think I'm not sure anything springs to mind on the derma bit, just because it's so specific to the photo. So I'm going to turn to my wiser colleagues to see if they've got better ideas than I do on this.
So Neil, before Neil responds, we'll go around. Sendel, you thought a lot about what what healthcare looks like at the limit. What's your, maybe starting from the place of dermatology, but where do you think this all goes?
Even just sitting just at dermatology, I guess I have two thoughts that I might kind of go back to. The first thought is I totally understand why you deployed it in the health system, and that makes complete sense. But I think there's one advantage to deploying in an app, which is that you will get many more people taking photos, possibly much earlier, people who might never choose to come in. In some sense, there's a selection of a huge selection bias in the data set of who gets into of who shows up. It's not a problem for what you're doing now, definitely not a problem, but it does seem like an opportunity to expand the scale and scope of people taking these photos. And just as an example, you can imagine that you catch some things much, much earlier. Now, I know you guys are sensitive to the overuse fear, and that's very real. Like the predictors trained on the sample that has chosen to come in might lead to a lot of false positives on this. So there's issues to be dealt with, but those strike me as statistical issues that can be dealt with over time. When you look at the scale of the opportunity, I think the scale of the opportunity is for the entire population and the ability to kind of catch early. That's one thought. The other thought that strikes me is that by virtue of building a device, if I understand how DERM is operating, it's basically a device. I should just verify my understanding. It's a device that is a camera, that the camera has, the images then are run through a deep learning algorithm of some kind. But if that's understanding, the nice thing about that is you have a form factor of an object that is now in the system. And for you to add additional sensors to that are not optical sensors, or at least they may be optical, but they need not be just a traditional camera, will allow you to sort of quite easily start collecting quite a wide variety of data. And it's just worth noting that so far, everything we've done in dermatology, not everything, but the large majority of it has been rate limited by the human eye. And there's no reason that has to be the sensor we use. There's a ton of sensors that we could imagine using that have nothing to do with it, that the human eye couldn't even possibly interpret them. And I think one thing I like about what we've done is by now having it as a device, you can easily upgrade that device to include new sensors. There's approvals, but putting aside the approvals thing, you have the easiest thing solved. It's not a new device you need people to start using. They're just getting version 2 of a device they're already using. So that strikes me as two pathways that I would kind of think about. One is radical changing the scope to which you're applying. And the other is radical change in the input modalities that you're taking. And it seems like you've set yourself up to do both of those pretty well.
Sendel, two comments. So first of all, just as you say, the device is just the device people carry around already, which is their iPhone or whatever, and then the lens is an add-on. So they connect this special lens, and as Neil described on their product roadmap, the next version of this won't require the lens. So then it'll literally just be your iPhone. But there might be good reasons to have that, an add-on device for the reasons you say. I know, Sendel, that you have been thinking hard about just the transforming the whole healthcare system to be focused much more on preventative. And so I think when you describe the two pathways, the pathway of do it yourself at home is being motivated by your overall view of the world of the healthcare system being much more heavily weighted towards preventative. Is there anything beyond what you've described of how you think the taking this technology into the home is changes the flow?
Like if you look at what's happening with prenatal stuff, and you look at ultrasounds, the rate limiting step in the whole thing is how rarely an expecting mother comes in to have an ultrasound taken. If you can have ultrasounds taken at home, which now we can, you can have ultrasounds literally taken every day. I mean, there's no rate. I mean, there's basically no rate limiting step at that point. Now, with dermatology, I would have thought that some of what the expansion of a lot of this stuff does, I don't know, now this is me, I don't know enough about the skin cancer end of stuff, but let me point out that there's a bunch of other dermatological conditions that are like much more prevalent. Psoriasis, for example, extremely prevalent, and we don't really understand much about it. And it's not life-threatening, but it is very much, it's very painful for people who go through bouts of psoriasis. So in some sense, one of the problems of things like psoriasis is measurement is just, I mean, I gotta go into the dermatologist every day to have or every week. So I think there's probably a lot of skin conditions where the ability to measure at very high frequency at low cost, which people who have these conditions will be very happy to do, I think is going to radically open up whole new avenues of stuff that we can kind of understand and treat better and really get a sense of what all is happening. So, psoriasis is a good example. If you want to go to things that we kind of view as, maybe you view it cosmetics, I don't know, but like a lot of people are very much worried about things like wrinkles and but we just don't have any data on like how wrinkles form. Like we don't know any of that stuff. So I think there's just going to be this opening up of some, dermatology seems ideal for this kind of opening up of understanding a whole set of skin conditions that we never really understood before. So to me, that's the enormous appeal of suddenly being able to, it's, if you think of it as, it's not just preventative, it's basically giving us this type of stuff is going to start giving us a window into whole categories of conditions that people are living with, but we don't really know much about it all.
And Sendel, when you think about just the economics, in other words, the business model for the company right now, they, for example, sell the service access to the platform to the health system. In the case where it's a at-home service that people are accessing just using their iPhones or their handheld device, have you thought at all about what's the economic model that makes that work?
I think that part of it is going to have to do with depending on the conditions. So, for example, with cancer, there's more and more interest in capturing the dollars that are saved when skin cancer is caught early. So there are many more reimbursement mechanisms where where the reimbursement incentivizes providers to catch that if it's caught early. So, for example, there are these capitation payment systems where health insurers pay a fixed amount per person. And so then it's in the incentives of the provider to keep costs low. In that world, you can see why health systems would take everyone who comes in for a regular checkup and say, hey, look, we've gotten this app for you. You should just, take a photo whenever you want. We might text you periodically. If you see anything, just send us a photo. So I think the incentives are there on those type of things. I also wouldn't overlook the fact that dermatological stuff has an enormous direct-to-consumer market. I mean, people really care. I think people care about their skin a lot. So I would have also investigated what are some direct-to-consumer market. I think it's not a coincidence that dermatology shows up in an episode of Seinfeld. I don't know if you guys remember this episode of Seinfeld where George is trying to show this guy the mole on his back at a party. I think it is. I'm not sure where it is.
It's a pimple popper MD, I recall.
Is that what it is? Well, that's amazing.
He calls a pimple popper MD.
Yes. So I think a lot of people would even be very happy if you said, I'll charge you to tell you if there's anything you need to be worried about. I think dermatology is the one place in medicine where there's enough demand on the consumer side where I think people, that and anything involving kids, where I think people will be very happy to pay. I mean, the amount of money people pay for certain skincare products is just wild. So even if you capture 1% of that, that's a lot of money.
Send a last question before I go to Rich is in a number of the prior episodes when we talk about taking the industry to the limit, we end up shifting from supervised learning to reinforcement learning. In other words, systems that learn from experience. And then the phrase I think you coined it, Sindel, I can't remember who, I think it was you that brought it up several episodes ago, was to make the system RLable. Do you have any instincts in the healthcare industry, and we can use dermatology as our setting, of how you would make this RLable for the system to learn and improve on its own?
I think I would find it very interesting to think a little bit about go to a drug manufacturer that provides some topical creams, like some cortisol, something that targets psoriasis. And then if you just look at that whole field, it's like we did one clinical trial, and then we say to people, here, apply this as needed up to 2 times a day. It's just the craziest thing in the world. It makes no sense. So you could easily imagine just working with a company like that to say, we're going to try to work out an RL system that where we take photos of your psoriasis on a regular basis. We give you suggestions of should you apply, not apply the cream, and we're just going to try it out together. Because most people are like, the doctor says as needed. And I think people are like, I guess I shouldn't do it unless it's absolutely needed. So I'll try to be on the safe side. It's truly a bizarre thing where we've left people to themselves. And psoriasis and these type of conditions, these dermatological topical conditions, are very common. And they're to the point where when you're very itchy, it is like really it can be debilitating. It's like, so these are not, they sound like unimportant conditions. They sound like one step away from like getting a nose job or something, where it's like, yeah, I guess you did it for yourself, but it's actually quite debilitating. So I could imagine something simple like that, where it's as like a one condition where you could sort of RL the entire pipeline and truly use this to change treatment patterns in a way that is actually where we'd learn a lot about what treatment patterns are working, because we have a chance through photographs, just in a way that we never, I guess that's a way of saying it, in a way that we rarely do with other conditions in medicine. We can actually look at both the photographs and some modest amount of self-reports about how itchy are you, to like actually start creating a loop to get stuff going.
Rich, that was a setup for you in terms of how you see that this what this could look like at the limit, in terms of how it would be very different than it is today.
First, I want to say something, which is, I'm a dermatologist patient, and I went in and I had the big thing. I had the skin cancer. I had the melanoma, metastatic melanoma. I almost died. It was 20 years ago, but it was a big deal. So it's all really real to me. Now I want to continue with the idea of the patient flow. Like as the video described it, you start with a patient who's kind of worried about their mole and wants to bring it in and have it be looked at, which, by the way, wouldn't have helped me at all. My mole was on my back, and we just took it off. And anyway, what would be another way of handling patients? One is to say, well, people are worried about their skin, like Sendel is saying, and or they want their skin to be healthy, and so maybe you could ask people to sign up. And this would be in a pilot program initially, where you'd say, oh, we're looking at different ways of diagnosing skin health, and can you volunteer to come in? You don't have a mole, but you have your body, and your body has got moles all over the place, and so if you could come in or lie in your bed and have someone take pictures of your skin, and then you'd enter into the system, and you'd have sequences. In other words, you'd do things like you might take a picture of your whole back, and then maybe you'd have close-ups on certain moles, or maybe you'd send that in, and the system would say, oh, give us a close-up of this particular mole that was on your back, and because it might be suspicious, we'd have to look at it more carefully. So take a closer picture, and so on. You proceed like that, and just think about what this would do for the machine learning aspect. The machine learning is very sensitive to the distribution of data that you send it. You send a lot of positives, a lot of negatives, you get different results. So if you were able to bring in people that aren't specifically worried about their moles, but but you could see their population of moles, and then that would be a very different distribution. It would be a very different number of hits and misses, and that would be towards the direction of preventative, overall being healthy, and obviously you'll get more referrals, which you're worried about, but we're talking about the limit. The limit, maybe that kind of thing where would be really desirable, and so it'd be more a broader portion of the population, and more interactive. What do you think about those ideas?
All right. Well, let me turn it back to Neil and Jack, and you can react or comment to anything you've heard.
Okay. There's so much that you guys covered. This is so great. I wish we had this conversation 5 or 10 years ago, but I think there is a lot to unpack here. And if I summarize it in the way that we think about it in two broad categories, there is the first one, which Neve, you touched on, and Sendil, you also touched on a little bit, and then Rich, you also brought it up, which is we've designed, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we've designed a healthcare system that has a primary care function, a secondary care function, and in some cases a tertiary care function. And we've done that because of the scarcity of the resource. And if you suddenly have an abundance of a resource, you can make the whole pathway that exists better, and that's what we focus on doing to start with. But you can also rip it all up and start again and start to reimagine a model where you are collecting data on a regular basis. Because one thing that we know for absolute certain is that patients are highly motivated to give data if they think that they're going to get something back. We don't have the resource constraint in terms of the expert ability to analyze and interpret this data. That's what the artificial intelligence brings us. And so you have no rate limiting factor on how much data can we get, how much granular information can we get, how can we start identifying earlier staging diseases. The sky really is the limit on this. There is so much data that is missing right now that we can start to collect if you redesign the way that this system worked. And we can now, for the first time, do it in a way that reduces the cost to the health system in total rather than drives it up. So when we go back to the founding mission of our business, we have two parts to it. One is we want to drive down the cost of care for skin cancer, and our ambition now is more broadly in dermatology. And the second one is we want to dramatically increase access. So we want to find the cancers earlier. We want people to be able to check themselves. We want the barrier to seeking help to be much, much lower. And because when you look in skin cancer, and when you look at the delay from a patient being worried about something into actually getting the treatment, and in cancer, the survival rates drop as the cancer spreads and progresses. What stops people more than anything else is not necessarily a diagnostic delay, which is a problem we really have now and is driving our business today, but it's that seeking help delay, which people aren't doing, that we want to tackle next. That is 100% where we want to go, because that is when it starts getting really exciting in terms of making a real difference on a global scale. So there's one side of things, which is like we can redesign the healthcare system now with a technology that changes everything about how we design care delivery. And then the second part, which I really loved and that we've started to do a lot of thinking about now, is we are looking at using a very, very, very narrow band of the information that exists about our skin by using optical sensors and only optical sensors. And we've had to do that because as humans and dermatologists, that's what we have. And we are now no longer bound by that. We can add all sorts of additional sensors, low-cost sensors, which matters to us because we want this to be something that happens outside of a hospital. But we can add all sorts of sensors to this to improve the information that we have to make decisions. And we shouldn't just be limited to what we've thought of as dermatology, which is psoriasis, eczema, skin cancer, inflammatory skin diseases, all of those sorts of things, which are a huge problem in their own right. But we strongly believe, and some of our advisors and dermatologists that help us think through this, there is a lot more information encoded in our skin. There's hypertension information, there's liver disease information, there is undoubtedly, and I'm going out on a limb here ahead of the science, which we want to prove. But I would argue that it would be remarkable if the only information that was available on our largest organ that is visible to us in every part of our body, and all that it tells us is if we're going to have an inflammatory skin disease or a skin cancer. I just don't believe that that's ultimately going to end up being true. And I think what we have as an opportunity is using dermatology as it exists now, redesigning the way the system works, but adding additional sensors and getting the downstream outcome data, which we focus very heavily on, to start to try and tease out what some of those relationships might be, and then try and build in solutions in the longer term, which really, again, opens up how we think about, a new level of zero care, if you like. Instead of primary care, we have something that sits in front of that technology is driving.
And Neil, sorry, AJ, just before you move on, can I double click? Because I realised that we all accidentally became somewhat politicians, and none of us actually answered AJ's question as to what ancillary data could be used. So just on the additional sensors beyond kind of visual, I saw online, and I'm super intrigued by this. So, and I think it'll be interesting for the audience. You mentioned things like infrared, but also audio as mechanisms for detection. Can you unpack what some of the other sensors of data that AJ kind of asked us about you could use as proxies for diagnosis?
Jack, did you want to jump in there? You've given this a lot more thought than I have at this moment.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, there's a huge amount of information in images. It being a very high bandwidth source of data, very high dimensional. And as Neil said, the image capture hardware that we use is focused on capturing data to present back to humans, whereas what we're actually doing is using a machine to analyze the data. So going beyond the visible light spectrum, I think, is a huge thing. The data, the type of image capture we use something called a dermatoscope, which uses polarized lighting. There are also options to use non-polarized, polarized and non-polarized. Depth information possibly could be something that's useful. Interesting thing is that we work in image recognition, computer vision. There are ways to embed sound in a way that you can also drop that in. If you convert an audio clip into a spectrogram, it actually sits inside the same type of model architectures as images. So all of these modalities kind of sit next to each other very comfortably. Anything that could be captured as an image or an audio signal, there's a huge number of things. I think what we're really interested in also is very high dimensional, high bandwidth sources of information. So that's why things like images are a lot more interesting to us than, say, a patient questionnaire or a patient survey. A bunch of tick boxes has nowhere near as much signal in it as an image. And I guess what we're really doing at the core is pattern recognition. We're industrializing, finding these patterns inside data. There's huge amounts of complexity locked inside our data sets. And what we want to do is harness that, learn some kind of internal data representation, and then use it to do something useful, whether that's diagnosing skin conditions, skin cancer, or something beyond that entirely.
Can I share a little anecdote on just to illustrate Jack's point? One of the things early on in the business that we identified when we're doing all of our research and reading all the research papers was that there are algorithms to predict the risk of cancer that are based on patients' medical records or a questionnaire the patient answers. Family history of skin cancer, there's a bunch of them. And they reported quite high sensitivities for finding cancer and reasonable specificities. And so we thought, okay, naturally, we're going to collect this data, we're going to put it in with the images, and it's going to make everything better. And it just didn't. It made everything worse. And it made it worse because most people find it very, very difficult to answer some of the critical questions. So has this changed? And I had a lesion that I got checked out by a dermatologist, and they were saying, it's interesting, is it new? And I said, I've never seen it before in my life. And I was getting really nervous, and he was planning to biopsy it on the back of me never seeing it and it appearing in the last 3 months. And then I saw a photo of me 10 years earlier, and then there it is on my face. And I just hadn't noticed it. And I was like, I had to call him up and say, I don't think we need the biopsy anymore. So I think that when you lose the fidelity of that data very, very quickly, you make a mess out of how these systems work. And so we want to try and stick to things that we can be really objective about rather than introducing much subjectivity in it. And we already deal with subjectivity in terms of histopathology outcomes. The discordance between pathologists is relatively high. And so we want to try and minimize the amount of noise that we have in our data and outcomes.
It's one of the interesting things in the area we work, I guess, is we're kind of at the intersection of medicine and computer science. So we have this world of grayness meeting this world of ones and zeros, and trying to navigate that is a really interesting problem.
To something you mentioned, Neil. I think, Ajay, the way you described it, you were getting us to think about other modalities. But I think, Neil, you reminded us of something else too, which is even just sticking with your modality, thinking of the skin as an early indicator of many, many diseases. It's worth noting that, like, amongst the things that were like classical medicine, like you go back hundreds of years, actually across many cultures, I think the things that people would look at are skin, teeth, and urine, basically. And so it's like, it arguably that's because that was the easiest thing to look at, but I actually think it's because there was genuine diagnostic. And you've all had this experience of looking at someone you know really well and just like from something on their face being like, I think you're falling sick. Like, so the fact that there's a lot of signal in that object, even with just images, strikes me as something very promising.
Okay, we're almost out of time. We'll just do a quick round robin to wrap it up. Neve, and then Rich, and then Sendel. Any final comments in terms of thinking? Neil and Jack have, they're building an incredible business, and this is one actually. Intrepid is an investor in their business, and very happy to be so. Springboarding from where they are today to our in the limit. Any other comments in terms of for listeners that might shift their sort of the Overton window in their mind of what healthcare can be with machine intelligence? In the types of things that we've spoken about. In other words, much more diagnostic power from, for example, images of the skin than we're used to, taking it upstream so that people are collecting data at home, perhaps in the interactive way that Rich described in his characterization, making the process RLable as we go. So, Neve, we'll start with you, then Rich, and then Sendel, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the challenge always with this is there's a possibility space meeting reality, both in terms of the reimbursement mechanism that Sendel outlined, but also you've got that trade-off between early detection is absolutely key for survival rates in cancer, but overdiagnosis and referrals can quickly outstrip the dermatologist and overwhelm the system. So how do you, that's a fine balance to tread. But I do think the timing now, back to your point as to why has it taken a decade to get here, a lot of it, especially in the US, is around that reimbursement mechanism, as Sendel unpacked earlier, of getting rewarded for preventative care and reducing speed downstream. And I think now that that's there, the chaps can indeed expand beyond just cancer to dermatology as a whole, beyond just psoriasis, but early indicators, pan-disease states, provided that they do get that longitudinal data and get to see where the patient goes over time beyond their platform. And I think that will be the difficult part of the business model. But if you think about it, jaundice, the first indicator is always your skin goes a bit yellow, or with smoking, your skin goes a bit gray, or the elasticity degrades. Bruising is an early indicator of a lot of autoimmune mechanisms as well. So the possibility space is huge. It's just how do they embed themselves both in the healthcare system to get that quality data and trust factor from the clinicians to actually utilize what they state, but also to Sendel's point, now start to leverage the trust and the quality that they've garnered over the past decade of hard work to then springboard into that direct to consumer in a way that I think a lot of the other healthcare apps failed because they were a bit too overpromise, underdeliver, and there was kind of a low adherence rate. So I'm super excited. And even if you want to really go beyond the extremes, I'm sure you can then start to use your device for routine care, such as eye tests, right? A lot of it when you go is just reading a chart and examining the back of the eye through reflection, probably even dental, like do you need fillings or not? I'm sure you can take a photo and start to look at some of those vision and care bits. So as the camera on our devices becomes better and better and more of a commodity, and the chaps and the company really leverages everything they've done to date. I think the possibility space is huge.
Thanks, Neve. And you, when you bring up the reimbursement part of this, we have to imagine that in the limit, not only are we advancing the technology, but we can, if Doge has taught us anything, it's we don't have to have our mind
constrained by the system. Yeah.
That's right. We don't have to be constrained by the system. And so somebody that were to, take the type of world that Sendel has in mind of healthcare much more weighted towards prevention, that the whole reimbursement system, you can imagine, is redesigned in order to accommodate that. And I guess in some sense, when the reimbursement system is redesigned, that is a lot, can be aligned with a reward system that lends itself to being RLable. Rich, any comments on your side to wrap up?
I think we might want to dwell a moment longer on the advantage of making it very interactive and having a higher cadence of interaction, rather than I go in once and then I wait a few months to get something else, and then I'm done, or maybe there's a step 6 months later. So we can get a cadence of, oh, I took this mole and it's analyzed, and then I need another picture of that mole from a different angle or a different focus or a different something or other. If we can increase the cadence of interaction, there are much more possibilities, I think, for being appealing to the patient. If the patient goes in and right away gets a result, and maybe they do something else, I don't know about you guys, but I think, well, I can go to the doctor, but if I go to the doctor, and get asked for this or that, it might take me, months before I get to the next step, and months later before I hear the results, and it's kind of discouraging. Anyway, I think our system has been designed. We get the expert and he does one thing, and then he's done. And if we could have our system with a higher cadence of interaction, it could be more effective in lots of ways and more RLable.
And Rich, that world is likely much more plausible when it's coupled with what Neve had said, which is it's no longer just about skin cancer. It's all these things, because then there'll be many more sort of benefits to the regular interaction, because it's not only detecting cancer. Sendel, last word is yours.
So let me actually finish us off where you started us, Jay, which is about, I guess you were gently trolling them by saying what took so long. And I think that one thing I'll observe is that we're in this sort of accelerated phase of these curves right now. And so for me, if I was running your company, which I'm sure nobody on earth would want me to do, but if I was running your company, I think the thing I'd be mainly, or if I was funding your company, I think the main thing I would be trying to do is to figure out how aggressive can you be, even more aggressive in a growth pattern where, like, there are a lot of opportunities that are lateral to what you're doing right now. And I guess my question would be, how aggressively can you seek out all of these other opportunities? Because it does seem like we're in this period where there's real value in sort of spreading out, if that makes sense. Like you've clearly had, for the earlier phase, you had the right strategy, like careful accumulation, laying the groundwork, doing it right. That strikes me as exactly the right thing to do. But we appear to be entering a phase where there is actually genuine value in like hitting many targets, trying many things, going in this way, not in an irresponsible way, but in a way that would seem unfamiliar, I think, to an organization that has been kind of very carefully accumulating in a good way. And so that's what I would be introspecting on, is how do we kind of expand the scale and scope of the next 5 years in a way that will feel almost bewildering to the care that you put into the previous 10 years.
That's a great point. And Neil, I'll give you 30 seconds to react to that. Like, in other words, do you understand what Sendel's saying, and does it make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you guys are really insightful in terms of, I spent a lot of time thinking about these things, and you've just come to it pretty dry on a little bit of information and are hitting it out of the park. So literally this week, we have the whole of our management team sitting offsite and talking about exactly this, that we have built our company about making sure that we can do what we say we can do. We are a trusted and competent part of the healthcare system that has slowly and methodically built the foundations to be able to be that, to play that role. And that is no trivial act. But the next act for the business is figuring out how we leverage all of that power that we've created to actually deliver on the potential of the business. And we're not delivering on the potential of the business if we're being used as a red light, green light within a healthcare system, taking a bit of pressure off the dermatology teams. And that's not our ambition. And so we're sitting here as a group thinking about how do we break off that mentality that has been so valuable to us. And we don't want to give it up. We don't want to just suddenly go, oh, we don't care about clinical outcomes anymore. Let's just go to town. But we also know that we can't act like we did for the years that it took us to build these foundations. And I think that is going to be very, very difficult for us to do. But it's something that we are 100% focused on. And I think part of it is having conversations like these and exposing the team to the conversations like these, where they can see the potential that we have and realize that the world's not going to stand still while we try and execute on this. And our job is to execute on it better than others and faster than others. And we're certainly up for the challenge.
Neil and Jack from Skin Analytics, thank you very much. Wonderful to have you here, especially when we're talking about something like healthcare, which, some of the industries apply to some people more than others, but this one applies to everybody. And thank you, Neve, Rich, and Sendel, as always. And Rich, I want to thank you for sharing your personal connection to this case that I think, even though nobody commented on it afterwards, made everybody just remind them how important this work is. And so thank you for sharing that. And everybody, we will see you soon in the next episode. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's our show for today. Thanks to Neil and Jack from Skin Analytics, as well as my colleagues Rich, Sendel, and Neve. Follow us on the Intrepid Substack at insights.intrepidgp.com. And subscribe on your favorite platforms, including YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
The views, opinions, and information expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Intrepid Growth Partners. This content is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as financial, investment, or legal advice.